So it looks like the US-Iran-Israel war has now escalated even further, with the Yemen-based group, the Houthis, having now announced that they're going to be entering and launching some sets of strikes against Israel specifically. This is just a quick take video, pretty raw, with some initial reactions, thoughts to what we've seen in the past few hours. And the situation seems to have gone in the direction that we all didn't want. It was still somewhat contained to the Iranian sphere, or the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf. But this has changed with the Houthis entering, because they're not just another group firing missiles. They're one of the few actors in the region that have already proven that they can disrupt global trade. So in this video, I just wanted to break down what's just happened, why the Houthis entering this is such a serious escalation, and how this could spread far beyond not just the Gulf, but in one specific area that I don't think a lot of people have fully appreciated. But let's jump into it.
This is the Global Gambit.
So for the first time since the war began, the Houthis have now fired a couple of ballistic missiles directly at Israel. They've been intercepted, but that's not really the point here. The point is what it's signaling. Because once the Houthis enter, you're no longer dealing with isolated fronts. You're looking at a coordinated, multi-theater, multi-front escalation. And that's where things really do escalate. Most people feel that the Houthis will focus largely on Israel, not wanting to engage directly with the Americans. But given just how overlapping all these things are, it's impossible to see how the Americans won't be drawn in to this other front as well. The Houthis, who are formerly known as Ansar Allah, emerged in the 90s as a Zaydiyya Shia movement in northern Yemen. Now, over time, they've evolved from this local insurgency into one of the most potent non-state actors, not just in the region, but in the world. They've been backed increasingly by Iran as part of its axis of resistance. But interestingly, many people believe that Houthis have always been slightly more difficult for Tehran to manage and retain some ideological independence there. They've managed to sustain air campaigns, they fought one of the bloodiest civil wars, and built up a serious missile and drone set of capabilities. So when the operations with the US and Israel against Iran started on February 28th, the Houthis were already incredibly battle-tested and strategically embedded in the Gulf of Aden in Yemen. Now, for the first month, as we've seen, they haven't really been part of it. And it's important because it's meant that the conflict so far, some people call it the Iran War, others calling it the Third Gulf War now, has been largely confined to the Gulf. There have been flare-ups, but key actors like the Houthis that people have been watching hadn't been activated yet, which many believe was because Iran was managing the escalation and keeping certain proxies in reserve. If we think back to October of 23, they launched hundreds of drones and missile attacks, not just on Israel, but the entire commercial shipping lanes in the Red Sea. The impact was immediate and shipping routes were completely rerouted. Insurance costs, as we've seen right now, surged, and the global supply chains were thrown into chaos, not including what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. At that time, for example, per container shipping costs nearly quadrupled. So again, I really want to emphasize just how since September 24 alone, the Houthis have attacked at least 25 commercial vessels using a variety of different means, and they have sunk some ships. So this isn't theoretical. They've done it time and again, and that's why their entry into this war really matters from the maritime aspect most specifically. The pressure point, the decisive points, the selective asymmetrical approach the Iranians have been taking, they elevate it even more and make it wonder for the Americans whether this is worth it. A Houthi official has also in the past few hours openly suggested that targeting the Red Sea, the broader Gulf of Aden, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is on the table. The Bab el-Mandeb is one of the most important maritime choke points alongside the Strait of Hormuz in the world. It connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and by extension, the entire Suez Canal to global trade routes. So 10 to 15% of global trade flows through this corridor, and 20% of oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. So we're looking at a fifth of trade and oil together being disrupted simultaneously. The economic fallout from this will be higher than that of the 1970s in terms of we've already got slow growth, and the implications of this as well with inflation leads to sustained stagflation, a very systemic challenge that frankly is near impossible to undo. regardless of whether this war continues for a week or another month, the fact that the Houthis enter this, and if they do this on a sustained amount that really risks shipping lanes and things like that from having to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, the economic fallout from this will last double what we've seen predictions saying it will last, which could be several months. That was just about the Strait of Hormuz. Now we're talking about the entirety of the sort of Gulf from the western side. And it also disrupts potentially Saudi Arabia and the UAE's efforts to reroute some of their oil distributions across overland terrestrially. It will implicate that. So the contingency plans that Riyadh and Qatar, Abu Dhabi have been making will be completely disrupted and frankly made redundant. But with all of that in mind as well, there's an even deeper layer. There's another component here, which I think hasn't got really any coverage at all, but could still happen. It's a bit far-fetched perhaps, but it's worth talking about. Because you see, when the Houthis enter this war, they don't just expand it northwards to Israel or the whole of the Gulf. They expand it potentially southern towards the Gulf of Aden and the Greater Horn of Africa. And this is where it starts to become genuinely terrifying. Because according to one recent report that came out late last year, there's been deep evidence of growing cooperation with the Houthis and the terrorist group known as Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Some of you might remember about 15 years ago, there was a sustained amount of piracy being done by Somalian pirates around the Gulf of the Horn of Africa. And it took a multinational coalition led by the United States to put a stop to this. They would shadow and eventually just disrupt the entire thing. And it had a very potent effect. Al-Shabaab controls huge swathes of Somalian coastline, and the Yemens are a very powerful military, quite organized militia group. So the two of them working together could, in theory, completely close off the Gulf of Aden. Al-Shabaab is much more extreme in some ways and has no real limitations in the willingness that they are willing to go to disrupt the entire economy of a nation state. Somalia is considered by most a completely failed nation, and that's because of the effectiveness of Al-Shabaab as a group. To put it more simply, the two have been smuggling weapons, intelligence sharing, undertaking tactical coordination, and most, I think, important in this regard is training in drone warfare and advanced explosives. Basically, it's not a sporadic regional dynamic. This is a networked insurgent ecosystem that stretches across from Yemen and East Africa with absolutely consequential implications for maritime security. So couple that with the Houthis' advanced weaponry and the Iranian backing, which relative to what they have to do themselves at home, if you like, is incredibly cheap, but incredibly effective. So all of these together, they extend the threat from the Greater Horn, from Somalia, all the way to the Strait of Hormuz in southern Iran. Now, I think a key question as to why a month into this war have the Houthis decided to enter. Well, I think to me it's about a mixture of timing and leverage. I talk about leverage quite a lot on the channel, but essentially by entering the war at this stage, they relieve the pressure on Iran and Hezbollah. The Israelis have entered onto the ground of southern Lebanon, and so that's a great amount of reprieve for Hezbollah. They can inject a new level of uncertainty into the markets, which are all over the place given Trump's erratic statements and U-turnings or TACO. But there's also a domestic angle here. Houthi operations, especially against shipping, have historically helped galvanize internal support in what is another failed state in Yemen. So this is both an external strategy and internal consolidation. Crucially, this escalation is also very calibrated because they are focusing on Israel rather than the United States, which means that they want to grow that pressure on Israel unilaterally without triggering overwhelming retaliation or trying to tip the Gulf states or specific Saudi Arabia, who was very active in Yemen in January with its own military operations, from targeting them. Many areas here, many scenarios, ways that this could play out. And with that in mind, though, I think that there are three main scenarios that come to mind. One, you could say it's sort of like a controlled escalation, a bit like what people have been saying with Iran and its managed escalation. Simply that the Houthis continue limited strikes and selective disruption, enough to apply pressure without a second front completely opening up. Second, they really put pressure on the maritime angle, make shipping around Bab el-Mandeb really, really risky and effectively shutting down like the Strait of Hormuz. And at that point, you're looking at an absolute global shock and likely the US having to directly intervene. Or thirdly, even more, that it spills over into Africa with Al-Shabaab and other individual groups getting involved. There are remnant pockets of ISIS that also exist in this area. And so the maritime insecurity just becomes completely systemic and basically uncontrollable. And while that scenario is absolutely extreme, I think it is still quite a possibility, depending upon how at risk, under threat, the Houthis themselves feel. Ultimately, the key point is that the Houthis entering this war isn't just about another actor. It changes the entire nature, the structural nature of this conflict. It brings in even more critical trade routes. It expands the geography unimaginably and connects networks, not just actors, in an escalation ladder, makes it much harder to come down from. So whilst Trump can talk about talks happening, there are obviously indications that the marine buildup is happening in different parts of the Gulf now, and seems to be that the Pentagon is planning for a full-scale land invasion, or a limited one at the least, to seize Karg Island, to take certain points of critical infrastructure. But doing that will only incentivize the Iranians to support the Houthis, to up their involvement. And therefore, any possibility of a drawdown, even to just a temporary ceasefire or more pauses, seems completely gone. And I think Trump is way over his head in understanding the slippery slope, the snowball effect that this will have, because he's thinking by only focusing on Iran, that the spillover effect sort of only happen within that area, but it doesn't. Or maybe there's a hope that by triggering Iran's activation of the Houthis, that triggers the Gulf states to get more involved, as they've been largely restrained and in a defensive capacity. Lots of speculations there, and obviously things are changing. I'll have another update tomorrow or even later today. But if you enjoyed the update, then do like it, do subscribe, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.